My name is Michelle Winters. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance for Housing Solutions, and I'm here to introduce Andrea. And before I do that, just really quickly, I want to give you a little bit of context. So this is a Leckey Forum. We run this forum definitely once a year. Last year at this time, we ran a forum that was kind of the beginning of this conversation. And in many ways, many of us who were here, how many people were here last year? So good turnout, right? So we started a conversation around race and ethnicity in Arlington last year and housing. And we thought, as soon as we found out what Minneapolis had done and how it was rooted in that same conversation, we thought it was a perfect opportunity to bring them here and can help us continue the conversation. So I'm very excited to introduce Andrea. She is the Housing Policy and Development Director for the City of Minneapolis. Officially, it says she establishes housing policy, finances, and redevelops single and multifamily residential real estate to improve access to quality, affordable housing for all Minneapolis residents. But she was among the leadership team that helped drive the Minneapolis 2040 plan that we will hear all about today, and we are very excited and happy to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I really appreciate being here with you all today. Aisha, that was such an amazing introductory comments that you gave, and exactly, I think a lot of what Aisha was talking about were really the sort of special ingredients that went into the Minneapolis 2040 plan, and our ability to be successful was really to highlight a lot of the issues and a lot of the lived experience that Aisha described. So thank you so much for that. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk with you all about Minneapolis 2040, but also learn from all of the great minds in this room. There are a lot of challenges that we face that are very similar, and there's a lot that we can learn from one another. So Minneapolis 2040 is a comprehensive plan. It was a plan that took over 2 years to develop. It was launched in 2016 and adopted by the Minneapolis City Council and the mayor in December of 2018. Minneapolis has 13 city council members and a mayor. And in the course of the Minneapolis 2040 plan, there was an election that resulted in a new mayor and 5 new council members. So the elected leadership that adopted Minneapolis 2040 was not the same elected leadership that launched it. Given that, the process was relatively seamless, and the goals and values that were established by the original council and mayor really carried through to the next administration, although there were some key elements of that election, I think, that led to this particular plan being adopted. So one of the things that they did early on was the council adopted a robust community engagement plan. And that plan had very intentional reach. That was really important to set community expectations around how we were going to be engaging with them, and also to set elected official expectations and other expectations about sort of what we feel is important in order to get the information we need to develop the most robust plan. They also approved 14 goals that you can see up here early on. These 14 goals, in turn, excuse me. Just gonna move this. I think this one is not the one I'm using. The 14 goals informed these 6 values for the comp plan that really guided us throughout the whole process. And I don't know if you can read all of these, so I'll read them off. Growth, equity, sustainability. Is that needed for me? Oh, I'm sorry. So growth, equity, sustainability, livability, competitiveness, and good government. So my talk today is the story of how we arrived at a document that meets these goals, and the barriers we encountered along the way, and the data that we use to justify our recommendations. It's important to note that you don't achieve this kind of policy document without a lot of leadership from elected officials. In our case, our city council president, Lisa Bender, and our mayor, Jacob Fry, were absolutely instrumental in moving this work forward with their colleagues, and were firm in their commitment to the progressive values they ran on. So this slide shows two different articles in The Atlantic. The one on the far left, The Miracle of Minneapolis, both of these were published in 2015. The Miracle of Minneapolis, the subheading says, "No other place mixes affordability, opportunity, and wealth so well. What's its secret?" That article was followed up by another called Minneapolis's White Lie. And the subheading there reads, "Despite being applauded by many, the miraculous, quote unquote, prosperity of the Twin Cities is only a reality for a certain slice of their population." Increasingly, we understood that the progressive Minnesota we knew was not the place we live in today. The Twin Cities suffers from the highest racial disparities in the nation in terms of home ownership, income, academic attainment, and incarceration. We happened, during this process, early on in this process, we happened to learn about a project called Mapping Prejudice. Mapping Prejudice is a project that was launched by Kristen Delegard, a professor at Augsburg, who's now with the University of Minnesota. So we learned about this in a Star Tribune article. And what Mapping Prejudice is this project to identify, to go search through all county records and identify all of the racially restrictive covenants that are filed against properties in Minneapolis. And so we learned about this work, we started funding this work, and so that they could complete the mapping project. It is still underway. You can imagine it's a tremendous undertaking, unfortunately, but it is. And we use this throughout our work. So this is an example of one of the restrictive covenants. I think everyone can read this from there. I mean, this is, there's thousands of these throughout the city. Practices and policies such as the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, redlining maps, such as the one you see here, for mortgage lending, prevented people of color from buying homes. Now, you can't read the legend here, but this is a map of Minneapolis, and the greenish-blue area down toward the bottom is labeled best. Then the purple areas are labeled still desirable. The mustard-colored areas are labeled definitely declining, and the pink areas are labeled hazardous. So again, this is an underwriting, a redlining map that was used prevalently. In addition, people of color were not eligible for the GI Bill after World War II. Most returning veterans used that program to attain a college education, which in turn led to access to jobs which allowed them to build wealth. Further impacts, which I appreciate Aisha bringing into this discussion, are from extensive urban renewal, tearing down large parts of our inner cities, of very well-established neighborhoods where communities of color lived, and the construction of our interstate highway system. In Minneapolis, those neighborhoods that were hit the hardest through the interstate highway system were North Minneapolis and Rondo and the 35W area. So these things really contributed to the geographic patterns of segregation and the continued extraction of wealth from communities of color. This is an excerpt from the FHA underwriting manual. This story really begins in the 1910s when some people began to use racially restrictive deed covenants to prohibit the sale of their properties to people of color. It was a marketing tool employed by many developers of single-family housing that preyed on Jim Crow policies and race baiting and led to this. This is a zoning map of Minneapolis dated 1954, when zoning becomes an official regulatory tool in shaping how the city looks and works for people based on race and income. Cities used zoning regulation to further enforce that redlining by not allowing the missing middle. And by missing middle, what we mean is the sort of the diverse housing options that you see in cities that typically is older, but it's the housing that isn't a single family home and isn't a large, multi-family, multi-story building. It's all of that in between: duplexes, triplexes, the 12 plexes, and 2-story walk-ups. It's all of that sort of missing middle housing. So cities use zoning regulation to further enforce the redlining by not allowing that missing middle construction in affluent areas and restricting zoning to single-family homes. All of this results in the map that you see today of Minneapolis. So this map shows where there are areas in our city where predominantly people of color live, and areas of our city where predominantly white people live. And the red shaded area is where the Mapping Prejudice Project has found the restrictive covenants. They're nowhere near done with their project, so this by no means represents all of the restrictive covenants filed on properties in Minneapolis. But you can see already from the work that they have done the incredibly strong correlation between where these restrictive covenants were filed, recorded, and where predominantly white people live in our city today. And as a result, we have one of the highest racial disparities in homeownership rates in the country. So this yellow line on top shows the homeownership rate for white Minneapolitans, and the other lines show the homeownership rate for Minneapolitans that are people of color. The lowest homeownership rates are among Black African American Minneapolis residents in the green line, and the American Indian population, which is the blue line with the circle. Minneapolis has one of the largest urban American Indian populations in the country. So all of that background and data to show, this is what we talked about when we went out and did community engagement. We talked about this over and over and over again throughout all of our community engagement, at community meetings, and really the conversations really started to percolate throughout all of these meetings and conversations in community. So this is like a poster board of that came from one of the community engagement meetings we had. We had maps up, and they were very interactive, a lot of the engagement that we did, where we'd have maps of the city, and we'd invite people to come up and circle where they live and say something if they want about their neighborhood, what they want to see, what they don't like about their neighborhood. And you can't really read this probably, but in the upper left-hand corner, I can't really read it. It says, eliminate all R1 and R1A zoning. And then this one here says, redefine R1 to include all buildings 1 to 4 units by right. So that got us thinking. We can't eliminate single-family zoning, can we? Who would do that? So this is another important, this is something that we also shared in all of our community engagement. We worked with, they were doing this work independently. We relied on it quite a bit in our engagement. The Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota created this report they call the Shrinking City Report. And basically what it shows is the top row, it's a map of the city of Minneapolis in the year 2000. And it shows where in the city, based on the median rent in neighborhoods throughout the city, where in the city you could afford to live if you had an average income for Black and African Americans. The second one shows the same thing for Hispanic or Latino, and the third map shows for the same thing for white, non-Hispanic, or Latino. So then you fast forward to 2014, and using the same measures, and you can see that basically the affordability has completely disappeared for Black African American residents, it's almost entirely disappeared for Hispanic or Latino, and has been a lot less limited for white, non-Hispanic, Latino. The goal of Minneapolis 2040 was to expand housing options for Minneapolis residents. That means more types of housing and more affordability in every neighborhood in the city. So the next few slides are going to highlight what the Brookings Institute said about Minneapolis 2040 plan. So, I mean, we know that part of the solution is to build more housing, period. And in a fully built city, you really can't do that unless you're willing to allow for more flexible zoning. Another factor here is to consider the role of land use in how much it costs to build housing, and whether there are ways to reduce that cost. And again, allowing more density can have an effect of lowering the cost by allowing more units of housing on the single area of land, and also reducing parking requirements, which are very expensive to meet. An important goal of Minneapolis 2040 is to expand housing choice and opportunity throughout the city, not just where it is most affordable to build affordable housing. And that is a really important element of the plan, and really hard to achieve. So that means, how are we building more affordable housing in higher cost neighborhoods? And so addressing and reversing racial disparities is about a lot more than housing. It's about educational attainment, living wage, wealth creation, stable and sustainable economy, access to amenities, lots of other things. But we really see and heard in our community engagement that housing stability is really foundational to all of these things. That's why we really framed Minneapolis 2040 that the housing affordability problem is a racial equity issue. And part of the solution has got to be to increase housing supply and choice. So step one in addressing housing affordability is to make sure more housing can be built because demand is outpacing supply. That's obviously not enough on its own, but it's the first step, a really important first step. Multi-story, multifamily development has been and will continue to be the primary driver of supply in a landlocked central city like Minneapolis. But if that's the only type of development that happens, then we're not doing much to increase choice throughout the city. So when we talk about choice, we mean allowing a variety of housing types. Think the missing middle that I raised earlier, and allowing that variety in more places. Our approach to supply is to continue to guide multifamily, multi-story development downtown and on our transit corridors. These are the places where most housing production has been taking place for the past 20 years, and that will continue. Downtown is filling fast. We introduced development minimums for the first time through Minneapolis 2040 to prevent underdevelopment. New buildings will now need to be at least 10 stories high. The same is true for our transit corridors. Every major street that has frequent local bus service, arterial BRT, bus rapid transit, as well as our light rapid transit lines, is guided for multi-story, multifamily development. And the most transit-rich locations have minimum developments as well. And this includes not only the dense parts of the city closest to downtown, but areas farther out where the existing condition is less dense and lower scale development pattern. Some of these transit corridors are lined with primarily single-family homes, but are opportunities for new housing in transit-accessible locations. And then we get to housing choice. Our neighborhoods closest to downtown have a mix of housing types, from single-family homes to small apartment buildings and everything in between. But for decades, the existing condition has been frozen in amber as down zonings continue to happen. The new approach in this comp plan is to reintroduce land use guidance that allows new housing to be built within this range. Making good on allowing housing choice also means taking a look at the parts of the city farthest from downtown that are primarily single family, are often high amenity areas, are the areas that excluded people of color through redlining, and are primarily white today. Through our comp plan planning process, we introduced the idea of increasing housing choice in these areas by allowing up to 4 units on a typical lot within the building envelope allowed for a single family home. So that's an important distinction, is that the initial thinking, the initial draft that we released allowed for up to 4 units on a traditional single-family lot, but only if it can fit into the building envelope of what would be allowed for a single-family home. This received the most opposition. Does that surprise anyone in this room? So after some additional research, we changed it to 3 units, learning that it's difficult to fit 4 units within those parameters. It also did help quite a bit in ultimately getting this plan passed. But really, this was the most challenging from the standpoint of community engagement. So I want to say something here about the benefit of incrementalism. We didn't, even though the Minneapolis 2040 plan really is a pretty bold plan and quite a departure from previous practice, there were a lot of little steps that helped along the way, that helped with the engagement, that helped residents see that maybe this wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And some of those things were adopting an ordinance allowing for accessory dwelling units. So this happened like leading up or during the comp plan process. So allowing accessory dwelling units, so allowing for that gentle density, and so that we could point out, number one, when it was happening, when there were ADUs being built, and there haven't been we haven't been overtaken by new ADUs in every lot in the city. I mean, but there have been a couple hundred. Some of them are legalizing ADUs that were already there. But having ADUs allowed, and then also allowing for more, changing some of the rules around where duplexes were allowed. So those were 2 examples of things that we did that were sort of more like incremental leading up to this place. So now we get to predictability. So we increase housing supply and choice by allowing multifamily housing in our downtown and on transit corridors, and by introducing more missing middle housing in neighborhoods outside of downtown. But none of this will work if every new development proposal is a fight at City Hall. So it's important to allow development as of right. So yes, we have design standards. Yes, we have robust development review process. But we came into this believing that we have to allow what we say we need to allow to achieve our goals. So the approach we take is to accompany the future land use map with a parcel-specific built form map. Okay, so this is where I tell you that I am not a planner. I'm also not a lawyer. My background is housing finance, housing development, community economic development, and policy development. So that was my expertise that I brought into our leadership team in developing the comprehensive plan. But it was too hard to bring the chief planner and our attorney working on this, all of us, to be here. That would be for a little bit more robust sort of delivery, but anyway, I just want to make sure I'm stating that. So our approach here is to accompany the future land use map with parcel by parcel built form map. And our zoning map is essentially done. We have basic height and bulk guidance for every parcel in the city. All we have to do now is fill in the details. This is our approach to making it legal to increase housing supply and choice, which is one step to ensuring housing affordability, not the only step, but one step to ensuring housing affordability, which is one step on the path to reducing racial disparities in our city. But of course, land use policy and zoning is not nearly enough, which is why we have also developed a very robust housing strategy in the city. And this strategy is informed by data and research on existing conditions and market trends. Examples of some of the data and research that we've used to inform our housing strategy are up here. These are just two examples. We drew from a much bigger pool of data and research, but just briefly, I'll describe these. The one on the left is a gentrification study that was done by the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. This was a really great study that had both a quantitative data analysis aspect to it, where they went in, looked at the city and helped us identify sort of what are the triggers, what are the early signs of neighborhood change, what neighborhoods are more likely to experience that neighborhood change. And really what we're getting after here is where is our greatest vulnerability to causing involuntary displacement. That's what our major concern is, and that's what we're trying to identify strategies to combat. We don't want the people who have made our city such a great place to live now priced out of our city. And so what are our interventions that we can target for that specifically? And the other really great thing about the study, which I would encourage you to go on their website and look at, is they have a really great qualitative component to this. Because people know when gentrification is happening in their neighborhoods. And it's what we heard over and over again through the community engagement process is that no one acts on it because they say that, well, we don't have the data to prove it. We can't we can't quantify that this displacement is happening. Therefore, we don't really know what to do about it, and we shouldn't do anything about it. So I think it's really important to lift up that lived experience, because people know what's happening, and to make sure that we're listening to and illuminating that is really important. The study on the right is from a nonprofit called Minnesota Housing Partnership. And what this is it's a market trends report, basically showing where the naturally occurring affordable housing is in our city and what its characteristics are. So in Minneapolis, more than half of low-income renters in our city live in unsubsidized housing. They're paying more than they can afford and more than they should for housing, but that's what's available. And that supply is dwindling quickly. So having really detailed data about where, what does this inventory look like, where is it, what are its characteristics, really help us devise better strategies to try to preserve the affordability and the quality of this really critical housing stock. The other piece of our housing strategy is we really had to just throw out the old model of developing a program and just putting it on a shelf and implementing it or administering it for the next 10 years. I mean, those days are over. The market is moving so quickly. Our city is changing so rapidly that we need to come up with a different approach to identifying potential interventions and trying them. So we've created this sort of pilot model where almost everything, a lot of what we're doing today is a pilot program. Where we're just trying something. I mean, it is data informed, it is research informed, but we're not studying it to death. We're trying to kind of work with the market, move with the market, and try things as we go. And this has resulted in some really effective interventions and some surprises. Things that we didn't necessarily think would be effective ended up being effective. So, and again, that's in response to the fact that our housing challenges are very complex and dynamic. They're changing all of the time. And so our response is a very broad set of strategies. It's not one, it's a set, including investment, policy, public-private partnership, innovative new programs, and tenant supports. The city, so investment is a key component of this. I always find it unfortunate that while local government investment is very critical and important, it's unfortunate to me that the main tool we have in Minnesota anyway, the main financing tool we have is based on property taxes. So it's like the one thing that makes housing less affordable is sort of like our main means of generating revenue to support things we want to do, like provide affordable housing. So, I mean, the unfortunate reality is that we can't property tax our way out of this problem. I mean, so, I think local investment is super important, but it's also not, it isn't going to get us there. In Minneapolis, we double, and also for some perspective, the city of Minneapolis has a population of about 420 people. I'm sorry, 420 people. 420,000 people in the city of Minneapolis. Yeah, I was so surprised when you asked me to come here and speak, 420 people. And we doubled our investment from 2018 to 2019. So my budget is $45 million. There's actually other city investments that we're making outside of this. A lot of city investments we're making outside of this that come in the form of approving tax increment financing, which is like a revenue capture sort of model to finance affordable housing that isn't really part of the budget process, but we're using that a lot more frequently. So I know you can't read this, but I just want to rattle off a couple of the larger investment areas that this represents so you can see just kind of the range of our investment strategy. The biggest section in blue is over 21 million, that's 47%, and that's for our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And our Affordable Housing Trust Fund is mostly targeted to produce new rental housing affordable to households with incomes at or below 50% of area median income, but the priority is for serving households with incomes at or below 30% of area median income. Then moving clockwise to the left, the next sort of orangish section is 6.7 million for our Minneapolis Homes program. In Minneapolis, we actually have I know this is a foreign concept, probably to a lot of people in this room, but we actually have a lot of city-owned land that isn't like for a park or a school or something that is actually for a public use, but is land that we still have from the foreclosure crisis and land that we acquired through tax forfeiture. Not a lot, but we have a couple hundred lots, and we're also proactively acquiring more property in other geographic areas throughout the city for this program. So Minneapolis Homes basically is the program that provides development assistance to build new homes. The next little gray spot, 2.1 million, is for homeownership education and lending, which we think is really important and support financially. The next one, the yellow area, 4.5 million, is for renter stability initiatives. So this includes NOAA preservation and also legal services for tenants. And the legal services are to help them enforce their rights to live in habitable housing and to have legal representation in housing court in eviction cases. As we know, there's really good research that shows that if someone has legal representation in housing court, their outcomes are a lot better than if they don't have legal representation, because the lawyers generally do have legal representation. The landlords, did I say that? Or did I say the lawyers? Anyway. The green area is 4.4 million to efforts to prevent and homelessness. So we have a really cool program that our mayor, Jacob Fry, really took the initiative to develop this year. And it's a partnership with the city, the Minneapolis Public Schools, and the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, and some social service agencies, including the YMCA, where we call it Stable Homes, Stable Schools. And that's about 3.3 million, and we're using that to identify children who or families who have school-age kids in Minneapolis public schools that are experiencing or at significant risk of experiencing homelessness. And so we're doing this is another pilot that we're working on that we're really, really excited about. So it's not enough to incentivize affordable housing through investment. If our council really strongly believes that if the city is going to essentially upzone the entire city and allow for as-of-right development, then they are committed to ensuring affordability through inclusionary zoning. Now, we've always had since 2004, we've had an inclusionary housing policy that applied to any kind of city financial assistance for projects. There was a requirement to include affordability. In 2017, we expanded that to include residential development on city-owned land. And then when the city council adopted the Minneapolis 2040 plan, they also adopted an interim inclusionary zoning ordinance that only applies to projects seeking additional density, because I know this is kind of confusing, but the plan is currently being reviewed by our regional planning authority. So while the city and the mayor have adopted it, it isn't in effect until the end of the year. So the interim ordinance captures all of the projects that are coming forward asking for rezonings, and then there will be an affordability requirement. But the city council also adopted staff direction telling me to develop a comprehensive inclusionary zoning ordinance that will apply to all development once the 2040 plan is in place, so in 2020. So that work is underway. And finally, I've talked quite a bit about the housing stability. We see this as really a critical part of our plan, to not just produce housing, but to work to help make housing more stable for our existing low-income households. And then another key area of our housing strategy is to create and sustain homeownership opportunities through capacity building, property development, and a variety of financing products. So our number one focus in our homeownership investments is to reduce racial disparities in homeownership. This is a photo of a home that was built, a single-family home that was built on one of the lots that the city owns through our Minneapolis Homes Development Assistance Program. 77% of the buyers of these homes are people of color or indigenous peoples. Another program that we have is we invest in homeownership education, counseling, and financial wellness. 80% of participants are people of color or indigenous peoples. And then our down payment assistance is 85% of the households served are people of color or indigenous. So these were not the rates of service a few years ago. So we've significantly increased the percentage of our funds that are going to help support people of color in homeownership in our city. So I've talked a lot about housing, but our approach is more than just housing. If we're going to provide living wage jobs, we need places for those jobs that are close to where people live. If we're going to do something about climate change, we need complete neighborhoods where people can meet their daily needs without a car. And committing to these goals through comprehensive planning means committing to allowing development to happen that will further these goals. So this is kind of collage of the things that we've heard about our plan, which, to be honest, was a surprise to a lot of us. It was really quite a big surprise because this is not exactly the reception that we got in town. This was not. So, and the biggest story of 2040 is not so much that we ended single-family zoning. It's and by that we mean we didn't end single-family zoning. We ended exclusive single-family zoning. But that's not the biggest story. The biggest story is that we're committing to eliminating disparities, providing affordable and accessible housing, providing living wage jobs close to where people live, and tackling climate change, all through land use planning, and we really mean it. So that is a lot more nuanced than a lawn sign can convey. When we released the draft 2040 plan, and that was when we still had the fourplex in there, the red signs popped up all over the outer kind of neighborhoods that are predominantly single family. So if you can't read those all in the room, that one says, "Don't bulldoze our neighborhood, change the 2040 plan." And the group is called, the opposition group named themselves Minneapolis for Everyone. And then the sign on the right was, "This home soon zoned for extinction." And then, but an interesting thing happened is that those signs popped up, unfortunately, everywhere. My block, everywhere around my neighborhood had those signs. And so the interesting thing is that where I live in a 100-year-old like story and a half house, and there's so much activity of houses like mine being torn down, and then like a huge single-family house gets built, and so like for sure 3 of my houses could fit in my neighbor's house. So it's kind, I think, and that was one of the things that we talked about, in neighborhoods, like, well, it's not like if someone, a lot of people too have signs in their yard that say "all are welcome here." And one of the interesting things is that there are some yards that had the red sign and the "all are welcome" sign, which is a little bit contradictory. But so anyway, after the red signs came up, there was the blue signs started popping up, and the one on the far left says "Neighbors for More Neighbors," and that was the name of the group that they organized. Really organized a really strong like advocacy campaign for this. And then the second sign says, "End the shortage, more homes now. Neighbors for more neighbors." So this kind of community organizing and support and advocacy for the plan was really critical in getting this done. So in a nutshell, what made it work? These 4 things. And I'm really biased toward one of them. I think we would not have adopted the plan that we adopted if any one of these was missing. I mean, that's for sure. But the one thing I think was really the most special part of our plan was the engagement piece. The engagement was so critical. And really, I mean, I think it really, we had so many people like that work for the city of Minneapolis, like engaged in this community dialogue, and it was really transformative for all of us too. Just in hearing from residents and hearing what are their concerns and what they want their city to look like today and 20 years from now, because this is a 20-year plan, and so it really, I mean, I think we all. Those of us that worked on this from the professional staff perspective really, I think, learned and grew a lot through this process. And I don't think any of us really set out to do exactly, in terms of like the specific land use recommendations that we made. But certainly we did set out to adhere to the values that we had established. So. I thank you very much for your interest in our work, and I look forward to the ensuing discussion.
So that was amazing. And we have a packed room, so I think you all thought it was amazing too. We'll take a few questions before we move on to the next panel. So since there's only one mic up here, or one that works, I will leave it to you to moderate those.
Great.
Pick your questions.
One there.
I've always felt that the way appraisals are done actually helps inflate housing prices, and it builds upon itself. That has to do with comparables. And if you were to appraise real estate just based on the physical qualities of the property and not what other houses in the neighborhood might be like, you wouldn't get this inflation effect. And so I'm wondering, were any strategies to change appraisal processes explored?
You are absolutely right, and that is an excellent question. So I think so there are words that get used kind of interchangeably, which are assessed, like the government assessed value for purposes of taxation, and then there's a sort of like private appraisal that you get when you're selling your house, or what the bank gets to make sure that they can lend you that much money. The issue that is a real, we see as a real challenge is the assessment piece of it. Because you're absolutely right. It's based on what properties are selling for, and these comparables, and that is increasing valuation. It's increasing the property taxes, which then results in increases in rents or increases in sales prices. And in Minnesota state law requires that local assessors assess properties in that manner. So for us, I mean, it has been raised a lot by a lot of different organizations, including affordable housing developers. A lot of people in the real estate industry really question how we assess properties. But for us, it would require a statutory change. And there are also a lot of sort of folks that are not wanting to make that change.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kathy Scruggs, and I want to know, trying to relate your capabilities and our capabilities in the development of this, how many of your public employees are able to live in Minneapolis now?
That's a good question. I don't know if we know what percentage of our workforce lives in Minneapolis. I'm sure it's a lot higher percentage than you have here. Minneapolis is not, our market is, we're experiencing a ton of change. We've like a lot of urban areas that are really, have a lot of amenities and are making a lot of investments. We have a lot of people moving into the city. We have super low vacancy rates. We have a supply problem. But we aren't, we're not DC, we're not San Francisco, we're not Seattle, we're not, so we still have, relative to the highest cost markets, we're still relatively affordable. But, we've seen such big increases that our low-income population is being priced out of our city. The scale is a little bit different than what you're experiencing here. And there's what we see as the benefit of that is that we can do something about it still. And not to say that you can't, because there are lots of different interventions that, can be pursued at depending on what stage you're at. But, when I was doing research on NOAA preservation, nobody in the country has figured out how to preserve this naturally occurring affordable housing stock. Like there's no silver bullet anywhere. And, in fact, some cities, Seattle is an example, it's gone. There is no such thing as naturally occurring affordable housing. It's either subsidized or it's not affordable. And so we sort of see this as, for our market, a really important, sort of closing window of opportunity where, if we're going to do something, we've got to do it now and we've got to act quickly. But I don't know if I answered your question.
Ken McMillan, I'm representing the NAACP as well as the Community Action Activist Board for Fairfax County. I noticed that you said engagement was a big part of what made it work. and we all know that we have a group of NIMBYism in here. I'd like to know how you deal with that head on without trying to isolate them or turn them away, to engage them, to bring them into the fold, to understand that this is great for everybody. If you have any ideas for that.
Can I ask you just a quick follow-up? Do you mean engage like the sort of like NIMBYs or opponents to
Yes.
this plan?
Yes, I'm sure that Arlington has had that same problem, but we have it definitely, we have it definitely in Fairfax County. And the thing about it is when you think of equity, equity is for everybody. It doesn't say that, hey, we want to exclude white people or we want to exclude them. We want everybody to know that this is moving forward for the betterment of all.
Yep. Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's exactly how we engaged folks that were inclined to sort of not be in support of this. You know, in the data and the research that we used, I mean, we brought those into all of these community conversations. And the point we were making is that we didn't get here by accident. We got here because of very intentional policies. And we're not going to get out of this without a similar focus on intentional policy. And so you can't really be for eliminating racial disparities, which is better for all of us, without being willing to take bold action and being very intentional in the policies that you create. And I think that really resonated with people. I mean, but I feel like having some tools for that discussion, like the Mapping Prejudice Project, like the Shrinking City research, like the gentrification, I mean, like having that, having sort of, some support for some of these conversations, I think was very, very effective. And I mean, we elected Paul Wellstone to how many terms? So, we all do better when we all do better. I think most Minnesotans really get that.
Sorry. My name is Doris Ray, and I'm speaking on behalf of members of the disability community. And I was wondering what Minneapolis did and what you did in your development of this plan to, number one, engage people with disabilities, particularly people with all types of disabilities, including physical and sensory disabilities, and assess their need for integration and inclusion into the community, and how did you, in your goals and objectives in this plan, set forth a plan for people with disabilities to both be able to live in the community and, excuse me, and be able to fully participate and get different types of housing, not just multifamily, but also what you call the missing middle. Many of us are that, and or single family housing through incentives for accessible housing and making it affordable so that people don't have to go into nursing homes. This being the 20th anniversary of the Olmsted decision, how are you doing that and keeping people from going into institutions?
Great, excellent question. There's a lot to that question. Am I not?
I'm just going to turn it.
Sorry. So part of our engagement was hosting meetings. We had a lot of those, but we also did a lot of engagement where we just went out and went to where people were. We talked to people on trains. I mean, we went to every sort of like community event. We were everywhere. We tried to be everywhere that we could during this period of time. We also engaged organizations that are trusted community organizations that serve populations that tend to not have as strong of a voice in public policy making. And so we did that very intentionally. And one of the things that we heard from persons living with disabilities was this incredible, we heard a lot about how our city is working and not working, and mostly not working in many ways. And a lot of comments about the importance of sort of what we categorize as this like kind of complete community. So walkable communities that are accessible, that have a range of housing options. So that was definitely a strong sort of voice that we heard throughout our engagement process.
Do you have a target for production of accessible housing?
The question was, did we establish a target for accessible housing? And we did not establish a target.
Hi, Mike Murtha. I spent several years on the Arlington County Planning Commission, and every time we tried to consider anything that would add density, more people to a neighborhood, the cry went up, what about parking? And you gave a very beautiful talk. I didn't hear anything about parking, and so what happens with that?
Good question. So we did, Minneapolis 2040 does call for reduced parking requirements pretty significantly. In some areas, no parking requirements. What we're hearing from a lot of developers is that they're having a hard time getting financing for developments unless they have a certain amount of parking. But not all. I mean, we are seeing, even before, so going back to this incrementalist approach, we eliminated parking requirements for developments of 50 units or less in transit areas. So, and we have seen a fair number of new, sort of that smaller scale building that is being built without any parking. But for the larger multifamily developments, we don't know that there's a strong market at this time for, from the financing standpoint and the just marketability of those units without some parking. We'll see if we get there someday.
And I'll insert myself here because I heard a good answer earlier. So how about for the triplexes? Can you describe your design points?
So as I mentioned, you can build 3 units, but we still have a process and we have design requirements. And in order to meet the design requirements, you have to score a certain number of points. And in most cases, it's really hard to score those points unless you have a detached garage. So some kind of structured parking. That requirement isn't increased. We're not, that's not increased beyond that was the case if you were building a single family home. And, by being able to add a second unit or a third unit, we're not saying you have to, increase the off-street parking along with that. But there is some parking requirement associated with that kind of development still.
Hi, Dana Lewis with the City of Falls Church. And my question is, in your engagement process, and if you're integrating them throughout all of the neighborhoods, the schools discussion, because that comes up all the time. Mm-hmm. So if families were to move in, some of the homes on your land and that kind of thing, how did you deal with that question? If we're built out, then the schools are built out and you're going to bring more, children into our neighborhoods, and then the schools are going to be overcrowded. And how did you deal with that question?
Great question. That wasn't a big issue for us. We have declining population in our Minneapolis public school system. So that's not, in fact, so that wasn't a point of opposition. What was a point of opposition was transportation. I mean, we don't have the robust metro system that you have here. We have public transportation, but it's not as robust as we'd like it to be. And it's one of those, things that you sort of have to generate the population base to justify the investment in transit. And but what happens in the interim where people are, more people are coming in, and if the transit isn't there yet, there's sort of that concern about what happens in the interim. And that was raised as a criticism of this plan.
Okay, we are going to have a whole panel with lots more discussion, and Andrea will be up on the stage in the next panels.